Before we get started, please hit those like and subscribe buttons. Thanks. My bookkeeping department will be glad you did. Right now, you're probably saying to yourself, you've heard enough about killer work files. You're right, you probably have. But the problem is that, given the number of complaints that still come into state appraisal boards, it's easy to conclude you weren't paying attention the first time. So again, let's go through this to make it clear what the components are of a killer work file. So let's get started. This is the 2024 definition. Now it contains the word analyses. Why is it necessary to include analyses in the work file? Because via the analysis of the data, which is what turns data into information the client can use, we arrive at a credible value opinion. Analysis shows what we did and how we did it. When we know what it is we did and how we did it, explanation of why we did it becomes simple and straightforward. Therefore, we have analyses in the work file to be able to make simple and straightforward summaries of what we did, how we did it, and why we did it. Note that even though USPAP allows for reference to data in other locations, some states require everything be in paper between the wings of a manila folder. So, know what your state law says on work file requirements. Now, let's talk about this definition and its implication for appraisers. Analyses was added to this definition. It wasn't there before. Analyses are part of scope of work and demonstrate the length, breadth, and depth to which an appraiser goes to conclude a credible value opinion. Therefore, all analyses, not merely those supporting the final value conclusion, must be in the work file. We need to understand the need for, as well as the importance of, iterations. To iterate, in the context of an appraisal, means to repeat a process. In an iteration, we change one variable in the process to determine the magnitude that change brings about to the final answer, if it brings any change at all. When it does not, this act of repeating a process or changing one variable to determine how or if it changes the overall outcome also carries the name sensitivity analysis. If making one change does not result in an overall change, then the variable we changed isn't important. This is how we know if we should make an adjustment. If we make it, but the final value range is essentially the same, that variable is irrelevant. As we engage in these analyses, we're analyzing the market, the subject, the comps, the whatever. This is what the definition means by iterations. We keep all of these in the work file. The proper iterative processes also show we did not engage in any bias in concluding a value. Now, let's talk about this definition and its implication for appraisers. Analyses are part of scope of work that demonstrate length, breadth, and depth. We've already gone over this. Therefore, all analyses, not merely those supporting the final value conclusion, must be in the work file. Let's consider the word support. The important part of this definition is the last part, without giving way. The support we have for our conclusions and our opinions must be solid. It must be so solid that when challenged, it will not give way. And we just talked about ways of supporting them. Basically, as we look at the word work file, we just went through what support means. If, in changing one variable, we see a relevant change in the final value range, then that variable affects value. And the quantity of the change is how much it affects market value. And engaging in that sensitivity analysis to determine how much one change affected value is the support we have for the adjustment. What the record-keeping rule says is that the work file must include, quote, all other data, information, and documentation necessary to support the appraiser's opinions and conclusions and to show compliance with USPAP, or references to the locations of such other data, information, and documentation. Note this rule contains the phrase, quote, to show compliance with USPAP, whereas the definition itself does not. Therefore, the act of properly maintaining a work file chronicles the act of complying with USPAP. This is what documentation is. Material that provides evidence, that serves as a record. Documentation will not provide evidence. It will not serve to record what we did and why we did it if it's not in the work file. Now, let's consider some work file content to learn what must be part of a killer work file. Note that we cannot cover every document here, every piece of paper, every note that must go into the work file. All we can do here in this video is stress that if we use something to support our value conclusion, even if we use it to eliminate something that would otherwise support a value conclusion, it should remain in the work file forever. Now, let's talk about support for legal, economic, and physical characteristics. Ask yourself why the legal, economic, and physical characteristics of the subject and the comps are important components of the work file. If the legal, ethical, and physical characteristics of the subject and the comps are not the same, how can they be comps to the subject? These are the similarities which make them comps. Without these similarities, a sale does not have the same highest and best use as the subject, thus it cannot be a comp. The legal characteristics of the subject come from documentation, such as, for example, the last recorded deed, the last recorded mortgage, the zoning and land use plan, building codes, and so forth. Economic characteristics of the subject come from any current leases, current first mortgage residential interest rates, potential income-generating uses to which the property can be put, and so forth. Physical characteristics of the subject include its GLA, construction materials, quality of construction, architectural style, number of stories, condition and effective age, levels of finish, levels of maintenance, site improvements outside of basic electrical and plumbing services, and so forth. Therefore, the data supporting the legal, economic, and physical characteristic of the subject need to be in the work file since we use them as part of the value conclusion. Our work file, our killer work file, is our defense against state appraisal boards, since these look solely to determine if the appraisal meets USPAP's Standard 1 and the report meets USPAP's Standard 2. It's a defense against plaintiffs, against reviewers, against charges of bias or discrimination from Fannie Mae, the borrower, the seller, the buyer, the broker, and so forth. It's a defense against angry consumers. And it's a defense against angry brokers. Now, quite frankly, brokers do not of themselves file that many complaints. However, they are behind a lot of consumer complaints. Here's how our work file defends us. The work file acts, or should act, as a repository for every action we took or did not take in coming to a valid, credible value conclusion. It should show, usually in chronological order, what we did or did not do to arrive at that conclusion. It shows those with whom we verified sales, when we verified them, the questions we asked, and the answers we received as part of that verification, and other data on our path to that value conclusion. It shows the extent of our analytics, our iterations, as we collected, verified, and then analyzed all information necessary on the pathway to a credible opinion. Finally, it shows the processes by which we reconciled our data into a value conclusion, the weight we gave each approach to value in the value conclusion, the weight we gave to the individual sales in the sales comparison approach, and above all, it chronicles why we did each of these. The point is, if our defense isn't in the work file, it won't defend us. It's that simple. What does a copy of an engagement letter support? This is our employment contract with a client. It tells us what the client expects of us. It should tell the client what we can expect from it, and it should contain the conditions of payment as well as the amount. It's important to understand that we should use our contract with our employer to limit our responsibilities. When you send out a letter of engagement, it's wise to include this quote, which is directly from Fannie Mae's own selling guide, specifically section B4-1.1-05, which is called Disclosure of Information to Appraisers, specifically the part about contract changes after the appraisal is complete. And this is a direct quote. If the contract is amended after the effective date of the appraisal in a way that does not affect the description of the property, then the lender is not required to provide the amended contract to the appraiser nor obtain a revised appraisal. Some examples of amendments that do not require the lender to provide the amended contract nor obtain revisions to the already completed appraisal report include sales price, transaction terms, financing concessions, seller-paid closing costs, names or initials, closing data, and correction of minor clerical errors such as misspelling. Do copies of emails work to support us as appraisers? A record of emails supports questions the client asked as well as our responses to those client questions. A question from a client that asks us to violate any portion of USPAP is a significant part of our defense in the case of a lawsuit, as well as illegal under Dodd-Frank. However, this would not be a great help before a state board, since we're supposed to understand that the client's requests, if improper, must be denied. We must deny them, and if necessary, we must withdraw from the assignment. What does a copy of the deed support? That the property sold, and in full disclosure states, the price at which the property sold. It discloses the buyer and seller, the legal description, the date the title transferred, the quality of the estate transferred, any conditions under which it transferred, who prepared the closing documents, potential reference to the mortgage, and so forth. A comparison of deeds on the same property could also indicate changes in value over time for a time adjustment, but be careful, since it's likely that there have been capital improvements to the property over the time between the two deeds. How about a copy of the mortgage? Why does an appraiser need a copy of the subject's last mortgage in the work file? Does the appraiser need a copy of the comp's mortgages in the work file too? That's the appraiser's call, but such copies support who the mortgagor and mortgagees were, the period over which the mortgagor will amortize the loan, the legal description, which should be the same as on the deed. If not, you need to find out why. Any prepayment penalties, if there are any guarantors of the loan repayment, and do the guarantors have any legal interest in the property. Consider what Standard Rule 1-2C Roman numerals 1 through 4 say. There's a whole lot on this slide, and we're interested mostly in what's in bold on the bottom of it. What this says is, and if the opinion of value is to be based on non-market financing or financing with unusual conditions or incentives, the appraiser must identify the terms of such financing and any influences on value. This is why we look at the mortgage recorded at the courthouse. This is why we verify the comparable sales and then engage in cash equivalency calculations when that's necessary. If the comp sold via funky financing, not available to anybody else in the market, and we, as appraisers, don't account for the price inflationary effects of that funky financing, then we give the client an opinion of value based on financing's effect on sales price. That's not what the definition of market value calls for, which is basically what the seller would have accepted and what the buyer would have paid in cash at the closing table if the buyer had accepted all that cash, each paying their own typical closing costs. How about just the public record in general? This would include tax appeals, building permits, building violations, floor plans. These are usually in the public record. However, they may not be easy to find or inexpensive to copy. But if you do not use these to form a value conclusion, there's no reason to get or keep them because, again, these are public record that will last forever. How about copies of HOA documents? Well, many of these documents are public record. They can be hundreds of pages long. It's most likely they'll be of record forever, so copies of them are not all that important if you need them in the future. Note, however, that budgetary and capital improvements data will be almost impossible to get since these are not public record and nobody has any obligation to give them to you. You could possibly purchase them from the HOA secretary. But the HOA can charge for them whatever it wants to charge, and you could be out a cash sum greater than your appraisal fee. Besides, even if you get them, unless you're a CPA and have access to other corroborating data, you don't know how to read them nor what they mean. When the GSEs ask you for such financial data, since they're generally not available to you and may be expensive, go tell the GSEs to pound sand. How about a copy of the survey or the plat? What do these support? They support the legal description, possibly the site's size, the site's boundaries, the site's shape, ingress and egress, any easements of record, the location, outline, and possible measurements of any improvements. That'll be on the survey, not the plat. The number of lots in the plat, whether that plat is part of a larger PUD. There may be an indication of the zoning of the subject, at least as of the date of the plat or survey, and there may possibly be flood zone data or other hazard data. How about excess or surplus land? Supporting our conclusion of excess or surplus land can be a challenge, especially when the GSEs tell us there is no surplus land, when we know full well there is. So, the first step is to compare the subject site as if it were vacant with the site sizes of the comps and the other site sizes in the neighborhood. Then compare the subject size with the mean, median, and modal values of these sizes, and I would suggest a minimum of 10 comparisons. Where does the subject size fit into this range of central tendency? Then look at the land coverage ratios, not including garages, sheds, outbuildings, and so forth. Use the same samples to calculate this so that when we do so, we're looking at a constant set of variables rather than a variable set of variables. Then get the mean, median, and modal values of these ratios. Where should we rank the subject within this range? Finally, we are going to check the zoning or the building codes or whatever to determine what that authority says about the land coverage ratios. If the land coverage ratio is, say, 30%, and the subject covers more or less 30% of the site, there likely is not surplus land since the site could not support more building area. If, however, the present improvements underutilize the site, in other words, the land coverage ratio is significantly lower than every other land coverage ratio in the neighborhood, then there is likely surplus land. What does a copy of the building improvements or building information support? How does a copy of data from the building department support the appraisal's final value conclusion? This information is usually available at the local county property appraiser's office. This will include the date of original construction, square footage as far as that authority goes. It may indicate if there was an excess of accrued depreciation at the time of the inspection. It may indicate the quality of construction, the condition of the improvements. There may be a note on there of any tax appeals, any capital improvements, their dates and their costs. It might even mention the contractors, so there is another source of verification available to you. What about all the recent sales data there is in MLS? MLS data may be the most important data appraisers have, since it's easy to access and copy. It's wise to look to the data to answer these questions, and I got a bunch of questions here. Why has the volume of sales changed in the subject's neighborhood or market area over the last 24 months? If prices have increased, is that due to an excess of demand over supply, or that the larger, newer houses have been selling? If prices have decreased, is that due to an excess of supply over demand, or that of the smaller, older houses have been selling? How, if at all, do these two market indications affect exposure time? Is it longer than typical? Why? Is it the same? Why? Less than typical? Why? What is the market support for those conclusions? Are there any pending changes in employment to affect marketing times? Why? What are they? Will the condition of the subject affect its exposure time? Why? How about highest and best use? Which types of properties does the market demand now? Old and small? Large and new? No difference? Why? Were the subject site vacant today, would the market improve it with a small or large house? 1 or 2 stories? How many bedrooms? How many baths? What would the architectural style be? These are all answers that are available, but will take some research to get into. How about marketing times? Is the relationship between demand and supply changing? Why? Have interest rates changed? Why? Are those changes in interest rates increasing or decreasing marketing times? Why? Is the local population increasing or decreasing? Why? Will that population change affect supply and demand factors in this neighborhood? Why? How about marketability? Is there anything about the subject site that will affect the subject's ability to compete with other comparable properties? What are those differences and why do they exist? What is the market support for that conclusion? Is there anything about the subject access, meaning its ingress and egress, that will affect its marketability? What? Why? Are there any deed restrictions, CC&Rs, HOAs, pending tax increases or liens, etc., to make the property less marketable than its comparable competition? Why? What is it? Is this a curable external obsolescence? Note, obsolescence when it comes to external isn't curable. Is there anything about the subject's construction, physical condition, or floor plan that affect its marketability? If so, is it curable? If not, will the market recognize it? Why or why not? What's the market support for your conclusion? And let's ask about FSBO, FSBO, or non-MLS data. Getting FSBO and non-MLS data is important. To seek data from solely one source is, by definition, selection bias, and every time we sign a certification, we certify that there was no bias whatsoever involved in forming our value conclusion. It's important that we appraisers never engage in any bias. Therefore, it's necessary to look for data in places other than merely MLS. These places include websites such as Zillow, Realtor.com, other realtors' websites, and so forth. They provide information on listings and sales, sometimes which are not in MLS. Remember that USPAP's Standard Rule 1-4 requires the appraiser to collect, verify, and analyze all information necessary for credible assignment results, not merely those data readily available through MLS. It's logical to ask Tim, okay, help me. How do I support my assignments? How do I support my adjustments? Well, we've got descriptive analysis, paired sales analysis, group sales, appreciated cost, ranking analysis, sensitivity analysis, market surveys, secondary data, in other words, data you purchase. And every one of these absolutely must, in their complete forms, be in the Workfile. Many of these can and do involve iterations. It's important that you keep each iteration, each set of filters, etc., in the Workfile so that it's clear the process you went through to arrive at a credible value opinion. How about highest and best use? How do you support that? What do you put in the Workfile for that? Supporting highest and best use can be one of the most difficult parts of an appraisal assignment. It's a difficult part of appraisal theory. It can be a challenge to support, yet it can be easier than a lot of appraisers want to admit. Basically, if the analytics for the cost approach show that the final value opinion, less the market value of the subject's vacant site, is a positive number, then this alone demonstrates that the current improvements are the highest and best use of the site is improved because the improvements contribute to the overall value of the property. This is the protocol the GSEs support and indeed expect. But the problem is, to do this requires the appraiser to understand and then engage in an accurate and replicable cost approach. Therefore, by not understanding simple protocol, appraisers essentially guess at highest and best use. And that is really easy for state investigators to prove when an appraiser guesses at highest and best use. I know, I do a lot of these analyses for state appraisal boards. Since this is not a seminar on highest and best use, we will not go into any depth on this topic here. I'll be happy to consult with anybody outside of this video if you want to brush up on the concept of highest and best use. In the cost approach, is it necessary to support the value conclusion? The answer is yes. There are 6 ways to do it. Comparable vacant land sales. Extraction from improved market sales. Allocation, also known as ratio analysis. Capitalization of the income the land generates. Residual analysis, and subdivision analysis. Just so you'll know, the GSEs expect and only allow comparable vacant land sales, extraction from improved market sales, or allocation, in other words, ratio analysis. Don't try the other three unless you're a state-certified general real estate appraiser because you're not trained in them. Now, I get this question a lot. How do I support the weight I'm supposed to give to each comparable sale? What I'm going to say now meets the requirements of USPAP's reconciliation standard. This is Standard Rule 1-6A and B. What most appraisers are doing now when it comes to reconciliation does not comply with that standard rule. First, we've got to organize the sales via their closing dates. The most recent sale gets the greatest weight. The oldest sale gets the least weight. Via this weighting analysis, we get the first indication of market value. Then we'll organize the sales based on physical proximity. The sale closest to the subject gets the greatest weight. The one farthest away gets the least weight. Now we have two indications of market value. Next will be to organize the sales based on their gross adjustment ratios. The sales with the least gross adjustment ratio gets the greatest weight, while the sale with the highest gross adjustment ratio gets the least weight. Now we have another indication of value. Organize the sales based on their GLA. The sale with the GLA closest to that of the subject gets the greatest weight, while the sale with the least similarity to the subject's GLA gets the least weight. There's another indication of market value. The next to last index is the number of adjustments. The sale with the least number of adjustments gets the greatest weight, whereas the sale with the greatest number of adjustments gets the least weight. There's only one more index to go. Finally, assuming there's a contract, you give the contract the weight you conclude it deserves. Of course, this assumes the contract is arm's length, meets the definition of market value, etc. Finally, after having developed all of those indices of value, then we get to weight the individual indices. If the value via the GLA index merits greatest weight, that's the weight we give it. If we conclude the value via the contract merits a lot of weight, then we give it a lot of weight. And you weight the individual indices. Once you've weighted the individual indices, not the individual components, that's the first step. The second step is to weight the individual indices. At that point, we're done. The market has told us what the value of the property is. Granted, you had to coach the market. You had to tease it out of the market. But you're still dealing with nothing but a range of market value. Therefore, your final value conclusion out of that range is one the market must support because each of the individual indices from which you derive that range has market support. And then, if you're going to round it as necessary. And the question has come up, do I have to have all of this information for the comps in my work file? That's a lot of paperwork. Yeah, it is a lot of paperwork. And while the work file was specifically designed, the concept of the work file was specifically designed to have only the data of the subject there, it is not going to hurt to have the data for the comparables there too. I appreciate you being with me today. Thank you. I'm Tim Anderson, the Appraiser's Advocate. If you have a question, please get in touch with me. My email address is tim@theappraisersadvocate.com, and you can see my phone number on the slide. I look forward to hearing from you. Remember, hit those like and subscribe buttons. I'll like it if you subscribe. Thanks. We'll see you on the next one.